Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Let's take a look at the domestic factors in economic development, and these would be the things that countries would have within them, within their boundaries, that would enable them to develop at a certain rate, maybe, or develop at a faster rate, a slower rate. Okay, so there are a number of domestic factors that may act as sources of economic development. And some would say, therefore, they may also act as barriers to development if they're absent or lacking. And these factors are part of the institutional framework of a country. So these are the things that are kind of maybe beyond the control of the typical citizen, that if you're in a country that has these domestic factors, then you're lucky. But if you live in a country where you don't, then you just sort of can do the best you can with what your country is giving you. Okay, so we look at several of these aspects in terms of different kinds of institutions. They include organization structures and rules for governing or supporting economic activity, but all of these are sort of set up by the broader governmental structure that a country may or may not have. So let's take a closer look. Well, the first one's fairly obvious, I think, and that's education. And obviously, improvements in education improve the well-being of a population, both the educated themselves and also society as a whole. If you remember back to, education is a positive externality of consumption, in that there are external benefits beyond those who actually consume the education. And though in the long run, of course, a more educated workforce is going to be a more efficient workforce, but it does much more. It opens up discussion and debate, and it's more likely in these societies that there'll be social change. So changing attitudes may achieve a number of development aims, and it's all related to education. So the benefits are widespread. One example would be like the improvement that improves the role of women. Right? There's no doubt that women are empowered by education, that there are high correlations between women's education and child survival rates. The role of women in society is hugely important to development, and women's educational levels are obviously critical to that because they make up half the society in most countries, of course. And the other thing is improved levels of health. And as a society becomes more educated, they understand the nuances of better health care, right? So people, especially women, are more able to communicate fully. Because of their educational level. People may read about or be more informed about, HIV or AIDS, poor sanitary habits, and all of that comes along with higher levels of education. And also, you remember back to the Millennium Development Goals, one of the goals was to ensure that children and boys alike would be able to have a primary education. So, at the most basic level, the provision of education requires vast funding. And this simply may not be available in all countries. And within a country where there may be large disparities in the provision of education, maybe in urban areas or in the countryside, you're going to see various factors or various levels of development. But education levels are really the critical piece of domestic factors that may lead to development or maybe be a barrier to it. Okay, the next thing is healthcare. Greater levels of healthcare, especially when combined with greater education levels, will improve levels of economic development. It's sort of education and healthcare lead to a better understanding of life and the influences. This influences life expectancy, and it would lead people to be making better decisions about their health. And you can look at all sorts of data from like the Human Development Index in countries that are very highly developed or high human development, and you'll see that the underlying message there, the underlying part of this would be that there's a correlation between education levels, obviously, but also levels of healthcare. And so these are one of the things that if you do not have in your country adequate healthcare, that is going to be a barrier to development. Okay. The next thing, number 3, is infrastructure. And a full definition of infrastructure might be the essential facilities and services such as roads, airports, sewage treatment, water systems, railways, telephone, and other utilities that are necessary for economic activity. And that's Jocelyn Blink's definition. And it should be obvious that improvements in infrastructure will, of course, lead to greater economic development. And I've told you this in other videos. I used to live in Nicaragua, and they're most, if you're not on the main road, which goes north to south from Costa Rica in the south up to Honduras in the north, you're oftentimes off on a semi-paved or poorly paved or even dirt road. And that leads to, that's a barrier to to economic development. There is one interchange, in the whole country of Nicaragua. Obviously, they have bridges that go over rivers and things, but in terms of like a network of roads that could be used efficiently, no, there's a lot of work that has to be done in that country in terms of its infrastructure. Other types of things could be. I don't know, radio and television networks, availability of gas and electricity is important to households, sewage treatment I've mentioned, right? And so you could take all of those things and you could sort of make a list of infrastructure that would help a country become, or prohibit, depending on how you look at it, become more economically developed. Next, let's take a look at political stability and lack of corruption. I actually think this is the most important characteristic of the countries that either develop or don't. And countries that have political stability are more likely to attract foreign direct investment, or FDI, and aid, and it is more likely that domestic savings and profits will stay in the country. Increased access to foreign direct investment, which is money coming in from foreign firms, may be more likely to contribute to increased growth rather than development. That's true, but access to aid in any kind will help. When there is political stability, citizens are more likely to have an input into who's running the country. Political stability is a critical piece of all economic development, whether it be from foreign firms coming in or not. And back to my Nicaraguan example, there is plans for Marriott hotels to put a huge resort on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua, and the government changed over, and Marriott hotels perceived the new government to be more unstable, like more likely that they were going to take away their ability to earn profits off their $60 million investment. And Marriott hotels took that $60 million and invested it into a similar resort in Costa Rica, about 200 miles down the coast. And as a result of that, of course, Nicaragua missed the chance of having this foreign direct investment, which would lead to a whole bunch of jobs, and not to mention a bunch of income from tourism. So this political stability is really critical. The other piece of that, of course, is corruption. Corruption is defined as dishonest exploitation of power for personal gain, and it obviously poses a huge challenge to both growth and development. Right? If governments are not accountable to people, if they spend large amounts of money on large capital investments, if their official accounting practices are not well formulated, if government officials are not well paid, if there's no legal structure in place, if there's no free speech, those kinds of corrupt things will lead to being a barrier to to economic development. And then there are other things, right? I mean, electoral corruption of any sort results in a barrier to development. And you can take a look in your course companion and look at all the different levels and different kinds of corruption. There are a lot of them. And where you see the most corrupt countries, you will see that they also tend to be the least developed countries. There's a correlation there. Okay, and the next thing is the legal system, which is, I think this one is fairly obvious. I don't know. The legal system, if the legal system doesn't work, then you're going to be less likely to invest money there. Now we live in Santiago, Chile. The banks here work. The legal system works. If I sign a contract to buy a house, I know it's a legal binding document. And therefore we bought a house here. Had that not been the case, if I couldn't trust the court system, the legal system, I'm not sure we would have bought a house. So that enables you to have the rights to own assets, the right to establish the use of these assets, the rights to benefit from the assets, like renting them out, the right to sell them, the right to exclude others. So property rights are critical to development. And if a person cannot guarantee his or her own ownership of property, then there's no incentive to improve that property, since it's impossible that the property will then be lost, or it's possible rather, the property will be lost, and the investment will have been wasted. And so if property rights aren't enforced by legal systems, there's a high chance that development will not happen. And building into that, of course, these all sort of go together. The next sort of domestic factor that could lead to development or not is the financial systems. Developed and independent financial institutions are essential if economic growth and development is to be achieved. And these are often underprovided in developing nations. If you've traveled around, you can see these. If there's unofficial markets that are not legally controlled, Usually they tend to be with like, exchange systems or something. There's these unofficial markets are an indicator that the financial system, the credit system, the microfinance system isn't working very well. And that results, of course, in savings. Savings is necessary to make funds available for investment, and investment is necessary for economic growth. Saving is difficult enough in countries where there are high levels of poverty, but it's even harder if there's nowhere to save the money that is safe and will give a good return. Another thing is financial services. If you live in a country that's where financial services are not accessible to low-income people, then they have difficulties figuring out how to save their money and how to borrow against their money. And so in developing countries, poor people may find it almost impossible to gain access to traditional banking and financial systems. And since they lack assets to use as collateral and are often unemployed, they lack savings. So there's many programs that have been put together. Microfinance is one of them. I suggest you look into it. It tends to favor women because women tend to be the best bet in terms of paying back these microfinance loans. It's a good way to finance rural projects in places that are undeveloped. All right, next take a look at taxation. Tax revenue provides governments with the means to finance necessary public services such as education, healthcare, and generally to improve the infrastructure of the country. However, if it's difficult to collect taxes, then obviously they're not going to have the revenue that they need, right? And it's particularly difficult for countries to collect taxes in places where there are no sort of formal markets. A formal market would be like a place like a school where I work, where I'm paid through an electronic deposit from a firm to my personal account, and that's very trackable, and the government therefore can make the firm responsible for paying my taxes for me, which is what happens in Chile. They pay my taxes even before I get the money, and that's pretty common. And as a result, it's there's a good chance that the higher chance that the Chilean government's going to get their money, get their tax money. But of course, if there aren't if there's informal markets and they're large, like you pay somebody to come to your house and paint it, and you pay them in cash. And if the majority of your economy is based on cash transactions, how is the government going to be able to track on all of the transactions that are happening, say for income, that would enable them, therefore, to collect tax revenue? So naturally, they're going to have lower tax revenues, right? And that makes it difficult for governments to promote growth and achieve development objectives, right? Furthermore, there are other consequences, right? Workers tend to be unprotected in informal markets and are very poorly paid, with little job security, poor working conditions, and social care. So productivity in the informal market tends to be very low, and therefore workers are often low-skilled, and the government cannot create the kind of environment for economic development. Next up is the use of appropriate technology. And this is a big thing. I mean, I know from my Peace Corps days, we were in the Dominican Republic in the hills, and we built this long rural aqueduct, and one of the critical pieces was to make sure that we didn't use any sort of technology that wouldn't be able to be maintained by the local population, which meant that we couldn't have any sort of sophisticated, plumbing devices. They all had to be very simple levers, simple faucets that turn on and off, done with regular PVC that you could pick up at the local hardware store. Because one thing that's really difficult is that appropriate technology, if the technology is used that's too far beyond the developed nation, it tends to be a barrier to economic development because it's not self-sustaining by the people who live in that particular country. And there are many examples of that. The next thing is the empowerment of women. I actually think this is, along with legal system, this is in many developing countries, the role of women is very much subservient to men, and changing this can change a nation. And there's no doubt that giving women more empowerment, especially in terms of education, could be a huge factor in the achievement of development, economic development. Improving their welfare, giving them greater education, improving their social standing has proven to change societies all across the board. If you think about women as the core element of a family, they become the core element of a community, they become a core element of a country. And when the country is empowering women, you will see direct payoffs in terms of development. And you can also say that the higher level education of women, of course, the more empowered they are, and also the freer they are to make choices. And that means even along the lines of leaving a husband if the husband is the marriage is bad or the husband is abusing them. Education levels empower women to have choice. And choice is the key. It's not what they do or what they choose, but it's the power to choose. That is true empowerment, especially of women. And the last domestic factor of economic development is income distribution. And although all countries in the world have income inequality, it's fair to say that the gap between the rich and the poor in developing countries is generally greater in developing countries. So high income inequality can be a barrier to growth and development for many reasons, right? There tends to be lower levels of savings because the poor have very small proportion of their income, are able to save a low portion of their income. The rich tend to dominate both politics and the economy, and this tends to mean that politics and policies are followed that are more in favor of the wealthy and not necessarily like pro-poor. And third, high income inequality in developing countries tends to be marked by the rich moving large amounts of funds out of the economy in terms of capital flight. And that's a good thing. That's a good point to make as well. The wealthier people have the ability to move money out of a country. And if, let's say, there are high levels of inflation in a particular country and you're wealthy and you can take your local currency and change it into dollars, which tend to be more stable, and put it into a foreign account, you're going to be able to do that. But that is actually going to decrease the development possibilities of a particular country because of the flight of that capital. So there you have it, the 10 domestic factors of economic development. Do not think of these in isolation. Think of these along the lines of the next series of videos, which is on international trade, because these domestic factors lead to attracting or not attracting foreign direct investment or aid from foreign countries, which tend to be the countries that are more developed. Okay, so I hope you found this video to be helpful, and we'll talk to you in a bit.